Chapter 4, Act 4, The Ties That Bind. Act 4, The Ties That Bind.
Rydia, no!
Cecil cried, grabbing the girl by the waist as she struggled to dig through the burning rubble that was blocking their way into what remained of Damcyan Castle. They had reached the castle gates, which were now collapsed around them. Tella, whose breathing was so raspy that Cecil thought for sure he was going to keel over at any second, looked around and took off around the corner. Cecil grabbed Rydia's hand and dragged her with him as he spotted Tella climbing up a collapsed tower that had fallen into the castle's grand hall.
Tella, wait!
Cecil cried. He grabbed Rydia by the waist and tossed her onto his back, climbing up after Tella. Tella had climbed into what used to be the grand hall, looking about frantically and running from body to body, checking them for life. Most of the bodies were still, and covered in soot and marble. Cecil wished Rydia would close her eyes, but he realized with a sharp pang that just 2 days before she had witnessed the same exact massacre in her village as she held her dying mother in her arms. So did it even matter anymore what she saw?
Anna!
Tella screamed.
Anna, where are you?
Cecil heard a lone moan come from a collapsed staircase. He walked over and saw a Damcyan soldier dressed in blue and white, half buried under the stairs. There was blood everywhere on the stairs and soaking the soldier's uniform. The soldier looked around as Cecil approached.
Who goes there?
Cecil realized he had gone blind.
Sir, I am a traveler,
Cecil began, feeling Rydia shake on his back as she took in the scene.
Are there any places survivors might be? The king? The queen? They must be in the throne room.
The soldier gasped, coughing up blood as he struggled to get the rest of his sentence out.
The prince? He returned today as well. Damn it all,
Cecil muttered, looking away for a moment to see where Tella had run off to. He was attempting to climb some stairs that were half buried in rubble. If Prince Edward returned, that meant Anna was probably with him. When Cecil turned back to the soldier, he saw the light had left his damaged eyes. He quickly closed the soldier's eyes shut with his index and pointer fingers, and followed Tella upstairs.
We should head to the throne room,
Cecil cried as Tella ran ahead.
Fool, where else do you suppose I should go?
Tella barked.
Cecil, I feel sick.
Rydia moaned, burying her head in his back.
The smell of the blood. I know, Rydia,
Cecil frowned.
Just close your eyes.
They came to a pair of heavy oak double doors that had once been decorated with golden shields and other emblems, all of which were now shattered on the floor before their feet, some with blood smeared on them. Tella struggled to push open the doors, but they would not give.
Let me do it,
Cecil said, and pulled out his sword, which was already glowing with dark energy. In a much easier effort this time, Cecil swung his sword and the doors exploded open, pieces of wood and stone scattering across the floor. They ran up a shorter flight of stairs covered in a soft, luscious red carpet, and stopped when they came to the room ahead. The ceiling and most of the walls had been completely blown away, leaving the open summer sky to surround them. Ahead were 2 golden, jewel-encrusted thrones, each with a body slumped down in their seats. Cecil could tell immediately from their dress that these were the former rulers of Damcyan. Their chests were covered in arrows, some of them still burning out. Blood was trailing down from the queen's blue lips. Several soldiers and guardsmen were scattered about as well, all dead and most of them maimed. But hiding in a corner was a slender young man with corn silk-colored hair sticking out of a velvet red feather cap, a golden yellow cape draped over his shoulders. He turned when he heard them come in, his face so pale that it appeared to be made of ivory, tears pouring down his cheeks from his soft brown eyes. Around his neck was a gold and jade scarf, made of some of the most expensive fabric Cecil had ever laid his eyes on. He was dressed in a rich red suit with a leather traveler's vest over it. Clutched in his arms was a young woman in a canary yellow gown, her wavy red hair pouring down over her shoulders and back. Her eyes were closed, several arrows sticking out of her chest, right over her heart.
Ah! Anna!
Tella sobbed, running over to the man and pushing him violently out of the way as he clutched the girl's body. The man cried out as he stumbled backwards and fell into a pile of broken stones. He looked so delicate Cecil was afraid he was going to shatter right then and there. Rydia whimpered but jumped down from Cecil's back, wanting to get a better look at the mysterious survivor.
It's you!
Tella snarled, gently laying Anna's body down on the carpeted floor and then turning to grab the man, pulling him up off the floor by his scarf.
You're the bard that is responsible for all this. And no.
The accused bard cried, even more tears rushing from his eyes.
It is not as it seems. Liar!
Tella screamed, and with that threw the man down, retrieving his staff from his cloak. He began to rush towards him, swinging his staff and fully intending to make contact with the man's head.
Tella!
Cecil cried, stop!
Tella!
Rydia whimpered. Instead of fighting back, the man merely held up his arms over his head. With a sickening crack, Tella's staff struck them and sent the man reeling backwards. Cecil shouted again. Stop! Tella marched over to where the man had collapsed, raising his staff again. The man looked up at Tella, tears streaming down his beautiful face, and clasped his hands together, as if to plead.
I beg you, hear my words. You spoony bard!
Tella ceded, this time swinging the staff so that it struck him in the side. He crumpled over as he cried out, Tella giving him a few swift kicks as he curled up into a defenseless ball.
Choke on your words!
With that, Tella raised the staff for the final time, squarely over the man's head.
Why won't he fight back?
Rydia cried.
Damnation!
Cecil gasped. Tella means to kill him. He raced over to Tella and the man, only to have Tella quickly counter with a fire spell. It was weak, but the flames were enough to push Cecil back for fear of getting burned alive.
I implore you.
The man whimpered, his voice now shaking as hard as his body.
Know this pain?
Tella muttered, raising his staff again.
Know Anna's pain. But Anna and I.
Just as the staff was about to come crashing down upon the bard's head, a soft voice spoke.
Please. Stop. Edward. Father.
As if in slow motion, Tella lowered his staff and looked toward the corner where the voice had come from. Laying there, her eyes halfway open, was Anna, her breathing labored. She had a hand draped across her stomach, a glittering diamond on one delicate finger. Dropping his staff, Tella rushed over to Anna's side, gingerly sitting her up and cradling her in his arms. The man, who Cecil could now only guess was Edward, limped over to Anna's opposite side, reaching out to take the hand with the ring on it. Tella was so enamored by Anna, he didn't even register Edward's presence.
Oh Anna!
Tella sobbed happily,
there is still some life in you yet. I will bring you home immediately to Capo and find the best white mage possible. Father!
Anna shook her head, a small smile curling on her blood-red lips.
Edward is. He is the Prince of Damsion. He disguises himself as a bard to avoid attention. You must forgive me for running off with him. But Edward. I am in love with him. And yet, Edward knew that we could not wed without my father's blessing.
Tella shook his head, looking up at Edward. Edward merely gazed down at Anna.
He convinced me to return to you. To get your blessing. And we were about to leave, when the Red Wings laid siege to us,
Edward finished, squeezing Anna's hand,
and they were led by a man named Golbez. Golbez?
Cecil asked, frowning.
Who is that?
He had never heard of such an individual in the Red Wings. Cecil knew every soldier's name.
He is a figure clad in armor of deepest night,
Edward replied in an almost poetic-like verse,
and his strength is far beyond that of a mortal man. And the Red Wings' purpose?
Cecil asked quickly. What would my mission have been if I were still captain today?
Our crystal.
Edward began to sob, his entire body shaking with each gasping breath.
And then they rained fire upon us. They killed my mother and father, and then Anna. She shielded me from the arrows.
The crystal. That's right. Damsion holds the crystal of fire, like my city's crystal of water. Tella looked down at Anna, stroking her hair back tenderly from her face.
You mean you love this man that much?
Anna nodded gently, her eyes looking up into Tella's.
Father, forgive me. For I have been so selfish.
She then set her gaze upon Edward.
Edward. I love you.
She closed her eyes, the smile still set on her lips as the last breath of life escaped her. Rydia clung to Cecil's side, but all Cecil could do was stare down at the floor. Tella held Anna's lifeless body close to him, and while not looking up at Edward, muttered, This Golbez. Tell me more of him. Edward, who was close to choking on his tears, gasped and squeezed Anna's hand.
I've only heard that he came to Baron recently. It would seem to me that he is using the Red Wings to steal the world's crystals.
He broke down and could say no more, sobbing louder. Tella huffed disgustedly and suddenly grabbed Edward's face, forcing him to look down at Anna.
Look at Anna. Tears do not bring back the dead, boy. What we need to do is avenge Anna's death. I'll find this Galbes.
He sprung to his feet and whirled around, his layers of cloaks smacking Edward in the face. Edward just sat there and clutched Anna as he watched Tella make way for the exit.
Tella!
Cecil cried, grabbing the old man's arm,
you shall not go alone. She was not your daughter.
Tella snapped, ripping away from Cecil,
so her killer shall die by my hand.
With that, Tella stormed out of the throne room. A few seconds later, Cecil could hear a faint voice calling teleport. Tella had vanished. Cecil sighed and rested his head against his hand. What had just happened? Why did all of a sudden things in his life just jump from one extreme to the next? And what the hell was Baron up to?
Anna?
Edward continued to cry as he set her body down on the floor. Rydia marched over to him and pointed a finger in his face, snorting.
Coward!
She cried. Edward looked up at her, blinking. Rydia steeled herself, her old courage returning to her in spades now.
You're a man, aren't you? Grown up. Stop crying. I have. Rydia.
Cecil trailed off. He knew this was her way of helping Edward, but it disturbed him greatly that a 7-year-old was comforting someone who had to have been Cecil's age, at the very least. A 7-year-old who had been through more trauma than a woman 4 times her age.
Well, you're right,
Edward said gently, which made Rydia jump a bit from surprise.
I'm nothing but a coward, as you say. And that's why I'm just going to stay by Anna's side. It doesn't matter anymore. Nothing does.
Cecil rolled his eyes. Now he could see Rydia needed some help convincing this poor sap. He marched over to Edward and picked him up by the collar, giving him a hard smack in the face. Edward gasped and covered the swelling red mark on his cheek as Cecil dropped him and took a stance next to Rydia.
You're not the only one who is grieving,
Cecil said calmly.
Anna would not want to see you like this, would not want you to be fawning like a fool. Besides...
Cecil shook his head and sighed.
I am in desperate need of your help. What?
Edward asked, still reeling from the shock of being struck.
What in the world do you need my help for? My name is Cecil,
Cecil replied.
My friend has taken ill with desert fever in Capo. She needs a sand ruby if she is to live. And for that, I have need of your aid. You have need of my aid.
Edward bit down on his lower lip, as if not quite believing this conversation was taking place. No one had ever needed him before, not even Anna. She had loved him, but that was something different.
I do. I'm begging you.
Cecil closed his eyes.
Rose's life depends on it.
Edward looked at Cecil, then back down to Rydia. Rydia still had a glare on her face, but her eyes held a genuine fear that she could not hide. Edward realized that their friend really was in danger. Cecil wasn't just trying to distract him from everything that had just occurred.
This woman you speak of. I can tell she means a great deal to you.
Edward nodded, and pushed past Cecil and Rydia, beginning to pace up and down the hall. A plan was beginning to formulate in his mind.
In a cave far to the east, there is a monstrous creature known as an antlion. The sand ruby is created by a secretion when the antlion lays eggs in the sand. There is no overland route, we must take a hovercraft that will carry us over the shoals. Is there a hovercraft here?
Rydia asked.
Yes, there is one docked here,
Edward said.
We can also use it to cross the shoals back to Capo as a shortcut. But first thing is first. We had best get going. Your friend has little time.
Finally. Cecil sighed. Rosa, I am sorry we are taking so long. But we'll be there soon. Cecil and Rydia headed back down the stairs to the rest of the decimated castle. Edward turned to stare at what remained of his life as a prince of Damcyan. Crumbling walls, a dead king and queen and a love that was never meant to be. He walked over to his mother and father, taking each of their hands into his. They were already growing stiff and cold. He closed his eyes.
Goodbye, mother and father.
He then let go and walked over to Anna, tracing one finger down her cheek over her soft, peach-shaped lips, and leaned in to brush his lips over hers. Banning the tears from forming his eyes, Edward whispered,
"Farewell, my love."
He took a miniature golden harp from his cloak and laid it in her hands before standing up and walking away, willing himself not to look back. Cecil and Rydia sat on one of the toppled gates from the castle, waiting for Edward to return with the hovercraft. Rydia was carelessly kicking at the rocks by her feet.
"I just can't believe Baron is behind all this,"
Cecil muttered, more to himself than anyone else. Rydia stopped kicking and looked up at him.
"Cecil, you are from Baron, right? That's what the soldiers said who attacked us at the inn." "Yes, I am,"
Cecil sighed.
"I was raised there by King Baron himself. I'm an orphan." "Just like me,"
Rydia replied, which stung Cecil more than he was sure she intended it to.
"But if you were raised by King Baron, how come you aren't a prince, like Edward?" "It's complicated,"
Cecil said.
"Kane and I, we weren't raised to be princes. We were raised to be..."
He trailed off. "Pawns, perhaps."
"But King Baron is still like your daddy then, right?"
Rydia pressed.
"Would a daddy really want to hurt his son?" I really don't know,"
Cecil shook his head.
"Like I said, it's complicated, okay? What's important now is getting back to Rosa as soon as possible." "Rosa will be so happy to see you, I can tell,"
Rydia smiled.
"I know you keep telling people she's your friend, but she's really your girlfriend, right?"
Cecil turned red and reached up to check and make sure his helmet was still on.
"No, Rydia, really. We're friends."
Cecil felt ashamed as he remembered how he had treated Rosa a few nights ago before he left for Mist. But now, more than ever, he realized it was critical that Rosa be removed from his life permanently. Just following him to Mist had put her on her deathbed, and now, what had seemed like a complicated situation before with the King of Baron had spiraled out of control with Cecil denouncing his allegiance to Baron and witnessing the men who used to work under him bomb an innocent kingdom. He had gotten himself in too deep. He wasn't sure what the conspiracy was that tied Baron to the crystals, but he knew it was his duty to find out what it was and unravel it. Once he had Kane by his side again, he would pursue taking on Baron. But for now, he needed to cure Rosa, find a safe place to hide her, and convince her once and for all that their time was over. If his love for Rosa put her in any further danger, he would never forgive himself. Rydia raised her eyebrows.
"Well, okay. But I've never kissed my friends like you kissed her in Capo. I'm just saying."
Cecil rolled his eyes, and luckily at that point the conversation came to an end because Edward came roaring up in the Damsayan Kingdom hovercraft, slowing the engine as he approached his new companions.
"Hop in."
Edward smiled.
"I'm your friendly antlion cave guide, Gilbert Chris von Muir. But you can call me Edward."
"Good lord," Cecil muttered, and Rydia squealed and started to climb in.
"Why in the world do you call yourself Edward if that's not your real name?" "Well, it's a lot easier to say than Gilbert Chris von Muir, isn't it?"
Edward smiled.
"Besides, it's a nickname I've had since I was a child. Buckle up."
The journey to the antlion cave was mercifully short. Cecil guessed that if things went smoothly, they would be in and out and back to Capo before sunset. Edward parked the hovercraft on a small beach outside the cave, and they went in.
"The heirs of the Damsayan throne have been able to tame and even used to keep antlions as pets as far back as the first generation of royals,"
Edward explained as they descended into the lair of the antlion.
"But after antlions became endangered, it became a kingdom mandate that they were no longer allowed to be kept as pets. So now we just watch over them in their various nests, and make sure they are not poached. We also collect the sand ruby so that people can be cured of desert fever." "What would you poach them for?"
Rydia asked, excited about her little field trip. Cecil bit his tongue and kept silent. Watching Edward and Rydia together was like watching two schoolgirls compare notes after class.
"They make a delicious antlion steak,"
Edward said, and Rydia gasped in horror.
"Oh, but no worries my dear, I've never had a real antlion steak. Just imitation. Anyway, there is a particular village in the far west that is actually quite fond of it." "So, is this antlion tame enough to collect a sand ruby from?"
Cecil interrupted. Even though he felt far better after destroying the door in Damsayan than he had trying to fight the Octo-Mammoth, he was weary of using the dark wave again too soon.
"Yes, of course," Edward replied. "Since this is the closest antlion cave to Damsayan, the royal family would visit here quite often. The antlion here will roll over if you tickle her belly." No thanks,
Cecil declined.
we're almost there,
Edward said, pushing through an entryway. They had entered a large, pit-like room, where a single pathway led down to the center of the pit. An antlion was sleeping there, and it was the most hideous creature Cecil had ever laid eyes on. It had a burnt orange, scaly body, with 4 limbs that jutted out in different angles like a spider's. Its head contained 2 massive bulging eyeballs, which Cecil could see moving under the eyelids. Jagged teeth were sticking out of the large, closed, mouth, and 2 ivory pincers gently clicked against each other as the antlion breathed. At the end of the pincers, Cecil could see the drips of what looked like a purple poison.
Eek!
Rydia squealed.
Allow me,
Edward said, stepping ahead and gently entering the antlion's pit. It snorted as Edward approached and opened one eye, which it kept on him the whole time.
Hello cutie,
Edward smiled.
I just need some sand ruby for a friend, okay? I'll bring you a treat another day.
As he spoke, he didn't notice the purple drips from the antlion's pincers getting thicker and more plentiful. Suddenly, the antlion opened its other eye, and the pincers snapped together.
Edward, look out!
Cecil cried, sliding down into the pit and swinging his blade before the pincers could slice through Edward's abdomen. Edward cried and jumped out of the way, and Cecil's blade connected and cut the pincers in half. The antlion growled in pain and began to descend upon Edward with gnashing teeth. Cecil plunged his sword into the antlion's abdomen, where blood and purple pus began to spurt out. The antlion roared and collapsed to the ground, its 4 legs twitching manically as its eyes closed, and it began to disintegrate into the sand. When it was gone, Cecil helped Edward up, and Edward's hands shook visibly as he brushed the sand off his cloak.
The antlion! It tried to harm me!
Edward cried.
How could that be? But Cecil, thank you! You saved my life! Monster populations have been swelling, and monsters that were previously more docile have gone hostile.
Cecil shook his head.
Obviously something is afoot. Perhaps it is because the fire crystal is now missing.
Edward trailed off.
You guys, we've gotta get back to Rosa.
Rydia reminded them, making both men jump.
Yes, you're right,
Cecil said, and Edward bent down, scooping up the sand ruby in his hands and safely pocketing it in his cloak.
Edward, is it far to Capo from here? Not at all,
Edward replied.
Let us hurry.
They emerged from the antlion cave and Edward steered the hovercraft to go south, toward Capo. Edward wouldn't admit it out loud, but the journey to Capo was particularly distressing, for it had just been a few days ago that he was speeding down there to pick Anna up, who had begged him by a carrier pigeon to fetch her.
My father will not be reasonable with me. He will not even allow me out of the house in fear that I will meet you in the streets. I fear at this point there is nothing more we can do to convince him that our love is not just the brief fancy of a wandering bard. I need to see you. Please, take me to Damcyan Castle, where we can talk this out together and plan our next steps. I will wait for you in our special place tomorrow eve. Love always. Anna. Anna.
Edward whispered softly under his breath. The hum of the hovercraft engine kept his words from carrying over to Cecil and Rydia.
I'll meet you in our special place. This last time.
After what felt like an eternity to Cecil, they arrived on the outskirts of Capo. Edward parked the hovercraft, and this time it was Cecil who got to lead. He practically sprinted through the village gates as he made his way to where Rosa was staying, Rydia and Edward struggling to keep up. Without even bothering to knock, he threw open the door of the house and startled the woman, who was standing at what seemed like her usual post at the counter, making tea.
Cecil! My word, what are you doing?
She cried.
You nearly gave me a fright. We have the sand ruby.
Cecil cried.
I need to see Rosa.
He sprinted up the stairs as her husband came in from the sitting room.
Dear, I think we should start locking our doors.
Suddenly Edward and Rydia burst in. Rydia ran right upstairs, but Edward, ever the royal, paused and made a deep bow to the lady and lord of the house.
Pleased to meet your acquaintances. Thank you for taking care of dear Rosa in her troubled time. The
woman sputtered, It's
Prince Ed.
Edward lifted his cap, bowed again, and then followed Rydia upstairs. Cecil was kneeling at Rosa's bedside, both of her hands in his own. Rydia was at the foot of the bed, peering anxiously up at Edward as he came in and fetched the sand ruby from his pocket. Cecil took it and gently pressed Rosa's lips open with his other hand. With the hand that contained the sand ruby, he began to crush it with his fingers, the powdered, sandy substance falling onto her tongue. After the sand ruby was completely disintegrated, Cecil stood and watched Rosa's face, waiting for any kind of reaction. She didn't move, with the exception of the rattled breath coming from her chest every few moments. "Please, Rosa, open your eyes." Edward and Rydia looked at each other. Cecil turned away anxiously and removed his helmet, setting it down on a nearby desk and running his fingers through his hair, the silver strands matted with water and sand. Suddenly, Rosa let out a violent cough and gasped, her eyes snapping open. She looked over at Cecil and sat up a bit, rubbing her eyes and moaning.
"Cecil? Is that you? Thank goodness you are safe."
Instead of smiling, Cecil frowned and immediately put his hands on his hips.
"Rosa? What the hell were you thinking?"
She shrunk back a bit and then blew her sweat-damped bangs out of her eyes, raising a finger and pointing it at Cecil.
"They told me you had died in the earthquake at Mist,"
she cried.
But I knew it couldn't be true."
She lowered her finger and sniffled.
"So I had to find you and see for myself."
She looked down and began to cry quietly in her hands. Cecil immediately turned red and felt himself began to weaken toward her all over again. It took all of his strength to restrain himself from pulling her hands from her face and pushing his mouth to hers.
"Rosa. Please forgive me for worrying you,"
Cecil said in as cool of a tone as he could manage.
"But you must tell us. What is all this talk of a man named Golbez?"
Rosa looked up, as if very surprised that Cecil knew that name. It caught her so off guard that she hardly noticed how he had spoken to her.
"Golbez is the man that King Baron placed in your stead to lead the Red Wings. His Majesty has been acting more and more peculiar since Golbez came to Baron. I can hardly be sure, but I feel that Golbez may be manipulating the king to get the crystals. There is the water crystal you took from Mysidia, then the fire crystal of Damsion, the air crystal of Fabul and the earth crystal of Troya." "The fire crystal has already been taken,"
Edward interrupted. Rosa looked over at him, and he gave a quick bow.
"This is Prince Edward of Damsion,"
Cecil explained.
"It was thanks to him that we were able to save you."
Cecil pointed to Rydia.
"And this is Rydia, of the village of Mist. Do you feel better now?"
Rydia asked sweetly. Rosa smiled, and nodded.
"Yes, thank you Rydia. And you too, Prince Edward."
"But..." Rosa shook her head.
"If Damsion has fallen, then the move against Fabul will be swift. We must..."
Rosa began to hack violently, covering her mouth and closing her eyes.
"You need to rest,"
Cecil chided.
"We will go and warn Fabul." "But how?"
Edward asked.
"The only path to Fabul is through Mount Hobbs, and it is currently blocked by a wall of thick, impenetrable ice." "Oh, that shouldn't be a problem."
Rosa smiled, regaining her composure.
"Rydia, you are a summoner, right? So you must be able to cast fire." No, I can't,"
Rydia said quickly, turning away.
"But you are a summoner, and that spell is the most elementary."
Rosa began to cough again, and Edward reached for a glass of water on the nightstand and handed it to her.
"It matters not Rosa, for you're in no condition to go with us,"
Cecil said firmly. Rosa looked up at him innocently after taking a sip of water.
"I'll be fine. I won't be a burden. Did you forget I am a white mage? You will need me."
Cecil stared at her. She stared back, daring to gaze straight into his eyes, which had hardened to ice. He turned away, not being able to take the look on her face. Edward cleared his throat gently, putting a hand on Cecil's shoulder.
"Cecil, Rosa wants to be with you, can't you see that?"
Rosa looked away, mindlessly reaching back and lifting her heavy, damp hair from her neck. As she tied it into a sloppy ponytail, Cecil's eyes crept over to watch her. The white curve of her neck was right there, inches away. He watched the tiny muscles in her neck flex as she swallowed another sip of water. "If Rosa comes with us, then at the very least I could make sure she was safe," Cecil thought. "If we came across a safe place to hide her, then all the better."
All right,
Cecil conceded, shaking his head.
we'll all go together. But it will be dark soon, so we should leave early in the morning. Make sure you get enough rest. I'll come with you to the inn.
Rosa exclaimed.
I shouldn't burden these people any longer. I really think you should stay here, Rosa,
Cecil said quickly.
We'll go to the inn and buy all our supplies, so you can just focus on resting. You're the one who needs it the most. Oh. Okay.
Rosa nodded.
I'll meet you outside of here tomorrow morning then, at sunrise. Great,
Cecil said, and grabbed his helmet.
See you then. Rest up.
He turned away and went downstairs, where Rosa's caretakers were waiting anxiously at the foot of the stairs.
She'll be fine,
Cecil said, and they both smiled.
Can she stay one more night to recuperate before we leave for Mount Hobbs tomorrow? Of course,
the woman nodded.
We'll take good care of her. Good to see you, Cecil,
the man added.
She was right to come after you, hey.
Cecil quickly pulled on his helmet and raised his arm before walking out the door, with Edward and Rydia close behind. After an evening of shopping for supplies and equipment for Mount Hobbs, luckily, the purse of Damsyan was much fuller than Cecil and Rydia's. Cecil made sure Rydia went to bed and barely pulled the blankets over himself before he was out for the night. But Edward couldn't bear to close his eyes, because every time he did, he saw Anna's face. After debating it in his head for 10 minutes, he decided it was best to take a walk. He quietly slipped on his boots and drew his cloak around his shoulders, and snuck out of the inn. Rydia and Cecil would never notice he was gone. Out in the cool desert air, Edward admired the quiet glow that Capo gave off at night when no one was awake. It was tradition in Capo village to keep candles lit in every home and business, even at night, to guide any lost travelers from the desert. How many times before had he met Anna in this village to just take a walk and talk about everything amazing the future would bring? They would take a couple laps around the village and then retire for the night at their favorite spot, before dawn came and Anna would need to flee back to her room before Tella woke up and found her missing. As if Edward's feet were carrying him on their own volition, he found himself standing there, underneath the palm trees by the oasis of Capo Desert. His and Anna's oasis. It was a small patch of sand that had never been turned into a road, and sat right at the edge of the village limits by the shore of Capo Oasis. It was basically a two-person beach. Sighing and taking a seat under one of the trees, he gazed down in the water next to him and shuddered at his reflection. The man staring back at him was a ghost, pale, with dark circles under his eyes and blotchy, swollen skin from crying all day. He would never again be the same, would he? How could he be?
Anna. I am so lost without you.
He moaned and closed his eyes, jumping with a slight start as his hand brushed over something cold. Looking down, he saw that it was a miniature golden harp. But it wasn't just any regular harp. It was the one he had left in Anna's arms before departing Damsyan.
What they?
Edward whispered.
Art. HSSSS.
A scaly webbed hand came swiping out of the water, shattering Edward's reflection. He cried out and stumbled back as a slimy Sahajan pulled himself out of the water and hissed threateningly at him. Edward covered his face with his harp and closed his eyes tight. A warmth filled his body, and Edward wondered if this was what it felt like to die. If so, it wouldn't be so bad, after all. Sorry, Anna. But now I'm coming to be with you.
Edward.
Edward's eyes snapped open and he looked up. The warm light hadn't been a welcome gift from death. It was emitting from Anna, who had appeared over the edge of the waters of the oasis. Her hands were clasped together, and her hair was gently blowing in the wind.
Edward.
She called again.
You must be brave, and fight.
The Sahajan, confused by the new voice, snarled and whirled around to swipe at Anna, but his claws went right through her. Edward gasped and stood up, clutching the harp.
Anna. I'll try. You are stronger than you know. But you must believe in yourself.
Anna nodded toward the harp in Edward's hand. Edward looked down at it and gently strummed the strings. They were as fine-tuned as the day he received it as a child. Closing his eyes, he began to strum out a haunting melody that made the Sahajan shriek and cover its tiny ear holes in confusion. It writhed around for a few moments before finally passing out and falling into the oasis with a heavy splash. Anna smiled and nodded.
I knew you could do it. Anna.
Edward cried, throwing down the harp and running to the edge of the oasis before his feet hit the water.
Don't leave me. Edward, I can be with you for but this moment,
Anna explained gently, opening her arms towards the sky.
The spirit calls me onward, to become part of it again. Anna.
Edward whimpered, lowering his head.
Edward, you must be brave,
Anna said, her voice and body beginning to fade into the night sky.
Golbez cannot be allowed to have the crystals. You gave your love to me once. Now share it with the world.
She gently pressed her fingers to her lips, held out her hand towards Edward, and disappeared from sight, her eyes being replaced by the twinkling stars in the sky. Edward moaned and sank to his knees, clutching the harp to his chest and closing his eyes. Anna, my love. I will try. But what would you have me do? End of chapter. Chapter end.